Welcome back, everyone. Alastair D'Silva is speaking to us on power management in the home this afternoon, and he'll be taking questions during the talk in Venulus and at the end of his talk as well.
G'day folks, I'm Alastair. I'm an open source engineer working for IBM's Oz Labs. I have a keen interest in home automation and I often run LCA workshops around this. I'm a firm believer in if something's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. So, on with the story. We moved into our current home around 2014. Promptly installed a 10 kilowatt PV system on a gross one-to-one tariff, where all energy generated by the system is paid out at the same rate as our consumption. We later added another 10k system on a net tariff, which offsets our usage until we produce more than the instantaneous power we consume, at which point we are paid a lower amount to feed the extra energy back into the grid. Around 2017, we did some major renovations to our house to address a leaking flat roof. So, side note, don't ever buy a house with a flat roof. It's just more trouble than it's worth. So, as a part of that, we installed a new, large pitched roof over the area. This also resulted in both of the systems being removed, and unfortunately, since the fire certifications on the panels had expired, we couldn't reinstall them. So we built a new system and ended up with this behemoth. So basically what we have here is the original 10 kilowatt Aurora inverter from the original system, which is that inverter there. And that is connected to these panels here on the east side and the north side. There's about 10 kilowatts of panels there. There's 3 new 5 kilowatt Solax hybrid inverters connected to this, which is the remains of the second 10 kilowatt system. So there's about 4.75 kilowatts there. And another 2 lots of 5.75 kilowatts of panels here facing west. Now, each of these hybrid inverters, here's one of them here. Each of these has a battery attached, which has 6.4 kilowatt hours of storage. And 2 of them have an additional extension, which gives us another 3.2. So all up, we've got 4 inverters, 26.5 kilowatts of panels, and 25 kilowatt hours of storage, which is a little bit more than the typical build-buster system that you frequently see advertised. I know it's a lot, but there is method to my madness. When we designed this system, we intended that our next car was going to be an electric vehicle. And also, despite adding a whole pile of insulation to our home during the renovations, it's still not the most energy efficient. So the only way to keep it comfortable is to throw energy at it. So how's this all wired up? Well, the original 10 kilowatt inverter was on its own 3-phase meter, and the hybrid inverters were each connected to a single phase of the house, offsetting our own consumption. We soon learnt that this was not a good setup, as each inverter tried to achieve net zero power on its own phase. On the surface this sounds ideal, but it created a number of artifacts, such as each inverter can only deliver a little over 2 kilowatts from its battery. If a phase required more than that, say a single phase air conditioner drawing 5 kilowatts, by the way, I specifically asked for a 3-phase air conditioner to be installed, but they only gave us a single phase one. So if you're drawing 5 kilowatts on any phase, there's no scope for the inverter on that particular phase to deliver more power to offset that. Another problem with this kind of setup is it's possible to get into a state where one inverter is charging its battery while another one is discharging. And in this situation, you're basically transferring energy from one battery to another and paying the round-trip conversion losses in the process. It was clear that a better solution was needed and a more holistic approach was required. The core enabling technology for this was adding an Eastrom STM630 V2 3-phase modbus energy meter immediately after the billing meter. And that's it there in our switchboard at the moment. This allows me to see exactly what the billing meter sees, and also allows me to optimize our energy usage to minimize our energy draw from the grid. The meter is connected to an Orange Pi via RS485, and they have a very well documented register set, providing way more information than I need. For example, phase angle, total harmonic distortion for both voltage and current per phase, active power and reactive power. I log a few things that are useful for diagnosis. In particular, one inverter kept shutting down in the middle of the day, and I was able to provide logs for that phase showing the supply voltage was rising above specifications, and the distributor was able to tap down the transformer in our local suburb to a lower voltage. The most important information I need from this meter is the active power per phase, and incidentally across all phases. When there is low load on a phase, I aim to keep the phase power to 0 watts. However, as the load increases past 50% of the battery's ability to deliver power on that phase, it switches to keeping the total power across all phases at 0 watts. This allows inverters on other phases to share the load before we start punishing the batteries with a high current draw. To act as a data repository and visualization tool, I'm using a package called Open Energy Monitor, which is this one here. So this is an open source framework designed specifically at energy logging and management. It provides tools to consume data from a variety of sources, e.g. the pulses emitted by typical power meters, or REST APIs, or even ESP8266 devices with power monitoring attached. And there's a variety of ways to display the data, such as fuel gauges, real-time graphs, zoomable history graphs, and more. So the most simplest device I have that interacts with Open Energy Monitor is the Aurora 10 kilowatt inverter, because it has no storage, it's really just a dumb inverter. For this, I simply interrogate the inverter over RS485 using the open source scraper for Aurora inverters from Kurtronics, which is this one here. So basically what this does is it runs every 10 seconds via a bash script and grabs this tab separated data out, and my script parses that into JSON and submits it to Open Energy Monitor via HTTP. You can also run it interactively if you want. It'll give you information like that that's a little more human readable. Not so much useful for automation though. Once the data is in Open Energy Monitor, it shows up as an input. From here you can perform a number of actions on the data, including logging and conversion. For example, looking here at input 2, power, we can see that I'm doing a log and a kilowatt hour conversion. So if we drill down into there, you can see I am logging the raw data to this feed called Aurora Input 2 Power, and then I'm integrating it over time to give me the energy produced on that channel. So once a feed has been established, that data can be graphed. So if we drill down into graphs, we should be able to pick our data out and have a look and see what that represents. So we go down to Aurora and we are going to look at input 2 power on one axis and input 2 energy on the other one. So we can see that as we generate power each day, we're slowly incrementing the amount of energy that we've output on there. I then did the same with the 3-phase energy meter. This time, I wrote a Python script to access the modbus registers as documented in the meter's datasheet and submitted the results to Open Energy Monitor via HTTP. So if we switch back to Open Energy Monitor, we can have a look and see how this shows up. And this mains meter section is where all the data coming from the mains meter is. So we've got really useful things like our phase voltages, power on each phase. So we can see here phase 3 is feeding into the grid at 3.8 kilowatts. Some other kind of useful information if you've got power issues like THD, total harmonic distortion, if you've got a device that's causing interference with other devices, this will help narrow it down. Reactive power, here we go, reactive amps, and of course total system power. Now you can see here I've got quite a complex set of rules here, and what this actually is doing is it's splitting that up into off-peak, peak, shoulder usage, so that back when I was using a time of use tariff, I could use this to calculate what my costs would be. At this point, I was able to obtain all the information I needed to write my own control algorithms for charging and discharging the batteries. However, I was missing one crucial bit of knowledge, which was how to control the batteries themselves. My initial thoughts were to fake the Carlo Gavazzi energy meter via modbus, which is an alternative but expensive energy meter that the Solax inverters support. Since it was via modbus, I could just implement that in software and trick the inverters into thinking that there is more or less power coming in than they need. This would, of course, allow me control of the inverters, but it would come at the expense of the inverter reported data being inaccurate. This was less of a concern for me since I had accurate data from the 3-phase meter. I was pondering on this for a while, as it seemed like a massive yak-shaving exercise, but then someone on the Open Energy Monitor forums contacted me and provided me a copy of the register map, which made the task an order of magnitude easier. With the register map in hand, I could start micromanaging the inverters. There are only a couple of registers that I need to write to in order to control the inverters. The first was entitled Remote Wake Up, which just needs a 1 written to it in order to wake the inverter up in case it's gone to sleep. At night, if there's no solar power available and the battery's finished discharging, there's nothing really left for the inverter to do in its default programming, so it'll go to sleep. Unfortunately, that means that when I make a request for it to go and charge off cheap off-peak power from the grid, it will ignore it because it's asleep. So we just need to periodically poke it using this wake up inverter command here, and that ensures the machine's awake. So the important thing for me here was that in morning peak times when electricity is expensive, but it's before our solar panels really start producing power, I need to have enough battery capacity to get me through that without having to draw from the grid. So what we do is we charge the batteries up to a certain point when power is cheap in the middle of the night, and that way we can coast through the morning until the solar panels kick in. The second register that I need to write is the charger power register, and that's what this discharge at function here does. So what this does is it takes a signed integer and it tells the inverter how much power to charge the battery with if it's a positive value, or pull from the battery if it's negative. My control algorithm has 2 main modes. The first attempts to keep the phase power at 0 if the load is less than half the battery's ability to deliver power, which is 1 kilowatt. In practice, this mode rarely gets activated these days as I have a cryptocurrency rig that draws more power than that. The more common mode treats the batteries holistically, spreading the charge-discharge load across all of them. This means that if phase 1 has a 3 kilowatt load, it is serviced by injecting 1 kilowatt from each battery. One issue with the Solax inverters is that although they can take 5 kilowatts of power from the solar arrays, they can only feed 4.5 kilowatts to the grid. To compensate for this, until mid-afternoon, I added some extra reserve capacity beyond which the batteries will only charge, at a low rate, if solar generation exceeds 4.5 kilowatts. This allows me to utilise energy that can be extracted from the arrays that would otherwise not be available. And so we can see it pretty clearly here in the morning. Battery was charging until it reached its cutoff limit. I think I've got it set to 75% at the moment. And then later on in the afternoon, at 3 p.m, it starts to charge again. Now, if this had actually exceeded the 4.5 kilowatt mark, we would actually start seeing a few more spikes of charging there, and that would allow me to make use of that power that I couldn't otherwise use. One complicating factor is that my gross feed-in tariff expired this year, so energy fed in on that meter was only paid at the net feed-in tariff rate and could not be used to offset my consumption. This was problematic as that was the only inverter with east-facing panels which provided early morning power. As a result, I moved that inverter across to the net meter as well, so that my household consumption, including battery charging from the other inverters, was able to be utilised the energy from that inverter. This did introduce another problem though, which is that Evo Energy, who's the distributor here in ACT, only permits a feed-in of 5 kilowatts per phase per meter. So I had to enable export limiting on the hybrid inverters to ensure that I do not exceed these limits. Once you have energy storage available, it does make a lot of sense to switch to a time of use tariff, and I also added the ability to switch parameters during different time periods. This allows me to reserve battery capacity to ensure I have sufficient capacity to get me through an upcoming peak period, and also to request charging from the grid up to a certain limit during nighttime off-peak periods as we discussed earlier. So if we have a look at the configuration of my setup here, we can show you how that's done. So if I go to CD, and so over here we can see that I'm defining a number of different periods. They each have a start and end time. There is a minimum charge that the battery is required to have during that period. And that basically means the battery will not discharge through the inverters below that level. There's also this grid charge option here, and this tells the system that during this particular period, it is allowed to draw from the grid to charge the batteries if the level is below the minimum charge. And what this allows me to do is, before the morning and evening peak periods, charge the batteries up to make sure that I have enough power at a cheaper rate to get me through the period where the rate is more expensive. This does require that you have a reasonably good estimate of how much power you're going to be using during each time period. And of course, if you estimate incorrectly, then you've charged your batteries using energy you've paid for rather than from solar, which isn't great. Or you end up drawing power from the grid during an expensive time, which also isn't great. So far, we've only discussed the battery management, but there is much more to smart energy management, in particular consumption. In order to accomplish this, I derive the power budget for each inverter. So over here you can see that we're deriving the power budget by looking at the battery power and the measured power flowing out on that phase. And this is an indication of how much power can be drawn from that inverter before power needs to be drawn from the grid. A bit later on in Open Energy Monitor, I also create a derivative power budget, which is how much power can be drawn before the batteries can no longer be charged. So first off, in terms of consumption, we upgraded our car to a Tesla, which is awesome. And it's basically a big programmable energy sink while it's parked in the house. The Generation 2 wall chargers, which are no longer available, but are visible here. So that's our charger. Can be daisy-chained via RS485 and speak a protocol which allows power to be shared between the chargers. Basically, the first charger knows how much it's allowed to draw, say 32 amps, and also how much it's drawing, say 16 amps. So it announces to the next charger down the line that 16 amps is available. The open source package TWC Manager, which is this one here, knows how to speak this protocol and pretends to be the first charger in the chain. And so by patching TWC Manager to read the power budget from Open Energy Monitor, I can ensure that the car will only draw power from solar. TWC Manager also provides a mechanism to draw immediately from the grid. So this is my instance here, and I can click on 1 day charge at 27 amps, and that will tell the car to draw as much as possible straight away. This would be useful if you expect to be driving interstate the next day and you can fully charge the car overnight, but in practice I've never had to use this feature. The next part was to manage some of the heavy loads in the house. And to achieve this, we're running Home Assistant to manage a number of devices. So this is my Home Assistant instance here. We've got a whole bunch of Zigbee sensors giving me temperature and occupancy information. We've got light switches, air conditioners, and of course the Tesla as well has an API, so we brought that in. Some of the media devices around the house. There's a lot of stuff being controlled in here. The advantage of Home Assistant is that it allows all of the integrated devices to be turned on and off via a local web interface, as well as via the Google Home devices throughout the house. It also has scheduling facilities and, more powerfully, Node-RED integration. So I wrote a JavaScript node in Node-RED, which is here. So this is the flow which manages the power in the house. And if we drill down into this configuration node, this describes to the software what devices are going to be controlled dynamically based on available power. So I've got my front air conditioner. This is really a rough estimate of the power that it's going to be used, and it'll use that to determine whether it actually has enough power available to bring that machine up. So we've got the front air conditioner, the rear air conditioner, and my cryptocurrency miner. And those are all that's configured in here at the moment. So once we have the configuration node, that's all gets aggregated into this power scheduler node. And we get the power budget information. So we've got the power budget and power budget with charging, and these are all live from my system as it speaks. There's also a couple of other messages that are going in here. So we look at the kitchen temperature and adjust the priority of the air conditioners based on whether we think the house is going to be comfortable or not. And there's one final thing here, which is power mode, which we'll discuss a bit later. So once that data comes in here, basically I've got this bit of JavaScript that looks through the available power, looks at whether devices are currently on or off, and then turns additional devices on and off if there is available power there. It's pretty straightforward. It's a little bit naive, but it seems to work 80% well. So we've got 2 ducted air conditioners in our house, and both can draw a significant amount of power. The first is a Daikin unit, and for only a few $100s you can get a control module that acts as another controller for the aircon and has a local REST API. Someone wrote an integration for this module in Home Assistant, and so I'm able to turn that aircon on and off and set the temperature from there. The second is a Samsung unit, which also has a much cheaper Wi-Fi module installed. Unfortunately, their Wi-Fi module is a little bit flaky and seems to drop off my network periodically, or at least it stops responding to pings. Now this also has a Home Assistant integration, although the setup was a little bit convoluted. Another large load that we had was the cryptocurrency miner. So this is basically a low-cost PC with 8 Radeon RX 580 GPUs and draws approximately 1750 watts. It's currently on all the time, which is no longer actually true because last night the power supply in it blew up, and so it's currently offline. But before the latest cryptocurrency boom, it was all controlled through Home Assistant. Originally, this was done by using Home Assistant to SSH into the machine and run scripts which started and stopped the mining software. However, after I noted that it drew 400 watts when idle, I configured the machine to start the software and boot and used a hacked Kogan smart plug to turn the machine on and off externally. Incidentally, the smart plug also has power monitoring, so I'm also able to detect if the miner has stalled, typically because a GPU has stopped responding, and externally power cycle the machine, which has resulted in much better utilization. As another aside, the power monitoring features of these smart plugs mean you can plug it into devices that do things over a period of time, such as dishwashers, washing machines, dryers, etc. And you can generate notifications when their power consumption drops below a threshold for some period of time, which more or less indicates that they're done. So you can then poke your home automation system to say, the dishwasher has finished, which is super useful because if you don't open it in time, then you get condensation and then you have to dry all the things off. So what's next? Well, I've recently switched from a time of use tariff to Amber Electric, who charge a fixed monthly price plus demand charges and a spot price for energy. If you have the ability to have good control of your energy usage, this is great, as when the spot price goes high, you can dump power to the grid and rake in the cash. The best I've made so far is $84 in one day. And when the spot price goes negative, you can draw as much as possible, for example, turning on all your high energy loads, charge all your batteries, charge the car, etc. Now, if we look back at our picture of our home, over here above the pool house, we've got an extra 8 solar panels that we just installed last week. Now, these are not grid connected, it's a standalone system. 4 of these panels now power a BDLC pool pump for filtering the pool, which is a significant energy consumer. And the other 4 are connected to a pump which we're about to plumb in to do the same thing for our spa. And this will effectively remove the filtering costs for these devices out of our energy consumption. Each of these water circuits also has a heat pump added, and this is going to replace the solar heater that we had to remove as part of the renovations, as I needed the space for all of these solar panels. It'll also offset the energy usage from the resistive heater in the spa, which I will disable for as much as I can, given that the heat pump has a efficiency of about 4 or 6 to 1. So for every 1 kilowatt of energy I put into it, I get 4 to 6 kilowatts of energy out. Now, I've added a solid-state relay to each of these heat pumps, and I'm currently designing a board to control these, as well as manage the pH and chlorine levels in both the pool and the spa. So this will give me another 2 to 3 kilowatts of controllable load to act as further energy sinks. Looking further forwards, I'd probably consider replacing our 3 instant gas hot water heaters with a single large heat pump plus circulators, giving us another controllable load, as well as the option of disconnecting from the gas network. This would be great, as those are the only gas devices we have in the house, and the subscription for gas service is not insignificant, so it would be a nice saving there. Anyway, that's about it for now, so if you have any further questions, feel free to hit me up. Otherwise, I hope you learned something interesting from this.
Okay, thank you, Alastair. And we have some questions for you. How is power direction measured in AC systems?
So basically, when current is flowing one way, so in line with, so when power is being consumed by the house, you'll have your current in phase with your voltage. When it's being generated by the house and fed back into the grid, the current is going to be 180 degrees out of phase. So the meters can determine which way the energy is flowing by looking at the phase.
Okay, and our next question is, what brand Modbus power meter are you using?
So I'm using a Eastron SDM 630 V2 Modbus meter, and they do publish the Modbus register map for that, so it's a nice meter to hack on.
Okay, and did you implement per circuit monitoring?
I had plans to do it, and I've added single circuit pulse energy meters on each circuit in the house, which is a lot. I think we've got about 20 or 25 circuits there. However, I don't actually have anything consuming those pulses at the moment. My main concern was getting the monitoring and integration of all the batteries down, and the three-phase energy meter was the defining point for that. The rest is just a side project.
Okay, and have you done some of the maths to figure out whether you're mining enough to make up the price of electricity?
So there's a great website called whattomine.com where you tell it what hardware you're running, or even better, plug in your hash rates and power consumption if you know that exactly, and it will tell you what currencies are profitable to mine at that current time.
Oh, that's good. So is time of use really better than the demand tariff?
That is a good question. The problem I have with demand tariffs is that if you accidentally turn on a high load during that peak period of demand, which I think is like 5 to 7 p.m. or something like that, it varies depending on the area, then you will blow your demand price up through the roof, even if you only do it for one day and you don't actually need that demand for other days. I think they basically take the highest usage per month and calculate the demand pricing based on that. So if you've got very good control and you trust it, then yeah, you could probably do better with demand pricing. And I believe Amber Electric, which is the system that I'm using at the moment, does actually do that. So in my bills, I get a demand price as well as the spot price of the energy. Typically, spot price for Amber is like 16, 17 cents a kilowatt hour.
Okay. So could some of the automations be configured directly inside of Home Assistant rather than pulling it out into Node-RED?
They could, but they start getting quite complex, and I really don't like having to deal with automations within Home Assistant. I feel it's a little bit clunky, and Node-RED is a little bit more intuitive in that regards. It does add some latency, but that's something I can live with.
Sure. And another question that's come in is, what's your read on the recent Home Assistant security issue?
I skimmed through the blurb very quickly and it recommended that I upgrade, so I upgraded. I didn't read too much into that, unfortunately.
Right. I'm just looking for the next messages, the questions. So we've done those ones. Sorry.
It's okay.
So what was the drone that took that photo? And it was the drone that took that photo solar powered.
Technically, yes, because the power that went into its batteries was fed from the solar system.
And somebody else has asked, how many people are in the house, considering you've got 3 hot water systems?
It's a 4-bedroom house, and there's myself, my wife, and 2 kids.
Yep.
They are toddlers, so basically 2 people.
Sure. And how much did your setup cost, including inverters and batteries? And what's the expected life before they need replacement?
That is a very good question. I think there was probably around 40 grand or so of hardware there. But then there was another, I think probably 20 to 30 of installation costs. Then the install ended up being a lot more expensive than I was expecting. And it just kind of dragged on and on and on. It took about a year to get everything installed. And in the meantime, the original company that was doing the install went broke and out of business. So I needed to get another Sparky to complete the work. Yeah. And in terms of expected life before they need replacement, I think the batteries are warranted for 70% capacity after 7 years. And at the end of the day, even if they only have 30 or 40% of their usable capacity left after, say, 15 years, I've got enough space. I can just throw more batteries in somewhere else, and really milk them for everything they've got.
Yep. So Trent has asked, or said, I was going to ask about Amber, but you already said you switched. Do you have it automatically tracking the spot price yet?
I do, and actually I could probably bring up my screen share. Let's see, which one is it? So if I look back at Home Assistant here, there is a power budget. Here we go, power consumption price. So that's the live data coming in from Amber. There, just towards the bottom right of the orange things across the top. And if we drill down into Node-RED, we can have a look at the logic that we use to manipulate that. So if we go into Power Scheduler, we have a virtual control called Power Mode. That basically comes out as auto or auto use power or save power, and then depending on what that is, it'll decide to switch on as much as it can or switch off as much as it can, or just switch things based on the available power.
Okay, and Martin Keeley asks, how much do the Tesla's batteries contribute to the household storage?
In terms of acting as a energy dump, they're pretty good. It's got 100 kilowatt hours of storage. However, I typically only charge it to 80%, so that brings it down to 80 kilowatt hours. And we typically will use maybe 40 kilowatt hours in a week. So the reality is it gives us maybe an extra 10 kilowatt hours or so of energy dump per day, depending on what our driving patterns were the previous day. I do when we set the house into use power mode, it tweaks the available capacity up 90%, so that gives us an extra 10 kilowatt hours we can dump into there if prices go negative.
And our last question is, have you considered solar hot water?
Yeah, so I think I'm not going to have enough roof space for that, and the toss-up between going with evacuated tube solar versus heat pumps, there's a big incentive to go towards heat pumps, because even though they're somewhat less energy efficient, they have a lot less maintenance issues, and more importantly, they're a controllable load that I can dump my more or less free energy into. As I said, Amber typically only pays me about 4 cents a kilowatt hour, so if I can burn it at home doing something productive, I'd rather do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk, Alastair.
No worries.